What would you do if the only thing you had left of your father was a map everyone told you was a lie? If the land he promised you, the future he sketched out in ink and hope, was stolen away by a man with a ledger and a smirk, leaving you with nothing but a folded piece of worn leather that the world called worthless? For one young woman in the vast, unsparing Wyoming territory, this wasn't a question. It was the cold, hard ground beneath her feet. But the truth waiting inside that map was not written in ink, but sewn in thread, a secret path visible only to a heart that refused to stop believing. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Rebecca Hale and the inheritance that was hidden in plain sight. Rebecca Hale stepped down from the stagecoach into the biting wind of Covenant Creek, her thin coat a poor defense against the dust and the deeper chill of defeat. The town was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by raw timber buildings, all of it huddled under a sky so vast and indifferent it seemed to swallow the sound of her own breathing. Just an hour ago, in the cramped and overheated land office, her world had been officially unmade. Silas Croft, the territorial agent, a man whose smile never reached his cold, assessing eyes, had slid her father's claim deed back across the polished desk. "A filing error, Miss Hale," he'd said, the words smooth as worn stones. "Regrettable, but the parcel was improperly surveyed. It has reverted to the territory and has already been reassigned." She could still feel the weight of the map in her satchel, the last tangible piece of her father, Thomas. He had spent 2 years charting this valley, not for gold, but for the sweet water and the sheltering ridges. "It's a place for roots, Becca," he'd written in his last letter, his script already shaky. "A place to build something that lasts." He died in a Denver boarding house before he could even break the ground, leaving her the deed, the map, and a faith that was now turning to ash in her mouth. She had shown the map to Croft, her finger tracing the curve of the creek, the stand of pines he'd marked as a landmark. Croft had barely glanced at it, a dismissive wave of his hand consigning her father's life's work to the realm of fantasy. "Charming," he'd murmured, "but not a legal document." Now, standing in the street with less than $3 to her name, the weight of his dismissal felt absolute. The wind whipped a strand of brown hair across her face, and she tasted grit. Men in trail-worn hats tipped their brims as they passed, their glances a mixture of curiosity and pity. News traveled fast in a place like this. She was the orphan from the east, the fool who'd come west to claim a ghost's legacy. Her options were stark and shrinking with the fading light. Turn around and beg for passage back to a life she no longer had, or find a way to survive here, in the shadow of the very mountains that were meant to be her home. Her gaze drifted down the street and caught on a piece of paper tacked to the livery wall, its edges fluttering in the relentless wind. The words were simple, stark as the landscape itself: "Help wanted, Split Rock Way Station, inquire within." It wasn't a future, it wasn't a home, but it was a chance to eat tomorrow. Clasping the strap of her worn satchel, Rebecca took a deep breath and walked toward the scent of hay and horses, the useless map pressing against her side like a phantom limb. Before she could bring herself to inquire about work, a bitter pride compelled Rebecca to try one last time. She found Silas Croft leaving the land office, locking the door behind him with a decisive click. He turned, his polished boots immaculate against the dusty boardwalk, and his practiced smile tightened when he saw her. "Miss Hale," he said, his tone suggesting she was a piece of unpleasant but necessary business. "I believe our affairs are concluded." She pulled the map from her satchel. The leather was soft from years of her father's handling. The ink faded in places. It felt like a sacred object, and holding it out to this man felt like a profanation. "This isn't just a drawing," she insisted, her voice steadier than she felt. "My father was a meticulous man. The survey points are here. The landmarks." Croft took it from her, his touch almost contemptuous. He held it up, squinting in the afternoon light. Laughter rumbled in his chest. He pointed to the lines of careful stitching that ran along the edges and in strange, meandering paths across the surface. "Meticulous? My dear girl, this looks to have been mended by a child. What are these?" He flicked a stitched line with his fingernail. "Did he use yarn to mark his trails? This is worthless. A fantasy." He tried to hand it back, but she didn't take it. His smile soured. "Look," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I feel for your situation. I do. I can offer you $20 for the map and for your trouble, a kindness, enough to get you back to wherever you came from." The offer was a final, crushing insult. He wasn't just stealing her land. He was trying to buy her father's memory for the price of a train ticket. "No," she said, the words small but hard as a riverstone. She snatched the map from his hand and turned away before he could see the tremor in hers. At the livery, the air was thick with the smell of hay and warm animals. A man was loading sacks of grain onto a sturdy freight wagon, his movements economical and sure. He was older than her, perhaps 40, with a weathered face and quiet, watchful eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. His coat was worn, his hands calloused. He didn't look up until he had settled the last sack. "Looking for someone?" he asked. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a creek bed. "The notice," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the wall. "For the way station." He sized her up in a single, sweeping glance. Her worn but clean dress, the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. "Can you cook?" he asked. "And you ain't afraid of work?" "I can cook," she confirmed. "And I'm not afraid of anything." He seemed to consider this, then gave a short, decisive nod. "Name's Arthur Pike. The work is hard, and the pay is what I can afford. You'll have a room and board. We leave in an hour." Just like that. No questions about her past. No pity in his eyes. It was a transaction, clean and simple. As she stood there, clutching the map Croft had called a fantasy, she felt a flicker of something that was almost relief. It was a bargain made in the currency of necessity, a roof over her head in exchange for the labor of her hands. Was it foolish pride that made her refuse Croft's money? Or did some deeper instinct tell her that the map, the last thing her father touched, held more than just ink and leather? What would you have done in her place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of the frontier. But for Rebecca, the choice was made, and the truth was simply waiting for a different kind of light. The wagon ride to Split Rock was a study in silence. Arthur Pike handled the team with a quiet competence, his attention on the road and the horizon. He was not a man for small talk, and Rebecca, shrouded in her own cloud of failure and fury, was grateful for it. As they left Covenant Creek behind, she saw Silas Croft standing on the boardwalk outside the saloon, a cigarillo in his hand. He watched them go, a smirk playing on his lips. He raised his glass in a mock toast to a man beside him, and though she couldn't hear the words, their meaning was clear in his posture, in the dismissive flick of his wrist. There goes the fool and her keeper. The laughter of the townspeople, the whispers that had followed her from the land office, seemed to echo in the rhythmic clatter of the wagon wheels. She was a stray, a piece of driftwood, and Arthur Pike was the quiet man who collected such things. A few miles out, where the road began its slow climb into the foothills, they passed a lone figure walking toward town. It was an old Shoshone woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her back straight as a pine. She carried a bundle of herbs, and her dark, intelligent eyes met Arthur's as they drew near. He pulled the team to a halt. "Lena," he said, his voice holding a note of respect Rebecca hadn't heard before. "Arthur," she replied, her own voice soft but clear. They exchanged no other words, but a long moment of understanding seemed to pass between them. Then, Lena's gaze shifted to Rebecca. She looked not at her face, but at the satchel on her lap, as if she could see the folded map right through the leather. Her eyes held a deep, knowing sadness. "The needle remembers the path," the old woman said, her words aimed directly at Rebecca, "even when the ink fades." Before Rebecca could form a question, Lena gave a slight nod and continued on her way. The cryptic words settled in the space between them, another layer of silence. Rebecca glanced at Arthur, but his face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. She didn't understand what the woman meant, but the phrase snagged in her mind. "The needle remembers the path." It conjured an image of her mother, sitting by the fire, her nimble fingers guiding a needle through cloth. Her mother had been the practical one, the seamstress who had stitched their life together while her father dreamed of valleys and mapped the stars. He had drawn the map, but it was her mother who had backed it with leather, who had run her own stitches along its edges to keep it from fraying. The memory was a small, sharp pang of grief. The sun began to dip toward the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of apricot and rose. The beauty was stark and immense, and it made her feel smaller than ever, a solitary figure in a landscape that promised nothing and owed her less. The way station was still miles away, and the weight of the town's judgment felt heavier than any of the sacks of grain in the wagon bed. Split Rock. Way station was less a building and more a feature of the landscape. Tucked into a shallow basin carved by wind and water, it was built of dark, weathered timber and native stone, looking as though it had grown right out of the rocky soil. A sturdy corral stood beside it, and a plume of smoke curled from the stone chimney, a lonely signal in the vast emptiness. As Arthur reined in the team, an old, gray-muzzled horse in the corral lifted its head and gave a low nicker. Arthur grunted in response, a sound of familiar greeting. "That's Calder," he said, gesturing with his chin. "He's seen more miles than you or I ever will." It was the most personal thing he'd said all day. The inside of the way station was clean and spare. A long trestle table and benches filled the main room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where embers still glowed. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and bacon fat. Arthur showed her to a small room at the back, barely large enough for a narrow cot, a washstand, and a single wooden crate for her belongings. A small window looked out not on the mountains, but on a sheer rock face, its surface scoured by ages of wind. There was no gentleness here. Everything was built for endurance. "Your duties are simple," he explained, his tone direct and devoid of sentiment. "Keep the main room clean. Have coffee hot when a stage is due. A hot meal for the passengers. I handle the teams and the freight. You don't need to concern yourself with the stable." He paused at the door. "There's a stage due through tomorrow, just after dawn. Means you're up before the sun." And with that, he left her alone. That night, the silence of the high country pressed in on her. It was a different silence than the one in the wagon. It was older, deeper, filled with the whisper of the wind over rock and the distant cry of a coyote. She unpacked her few belongings, the movement small and inadequate in the face of such emptiness. Finally, she took out the map. She unrolled it on the cot, the single candle on her crate casting flickering shadows across its surface. In the dim light, it looked exactly as Silas Croft had described it, a child's fantasy. The lines her father had drawn with such precision seemed crude, the stitched patterns nonsensical. Disappointment settled in her stomach, a cold, heavy stone. This was what she had clung to? This ragged piece of leather and paper? She traced the lines of thread her mother had sewn, the stitches small and even. It was just reinforcement, a border to protect a foolish dream. She remembered her father hunched over this very map, his face alight with a passion she hadn't understood. He had seen a paradise here. She saw only a testament to a broken promise. The wind howled against the rock face outside her window, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to echo the desolation in her own heart. Days at the way station settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the stagecoach schedule. Rebecca rose in the blue-gray dark before dawn, coaxing the fire back to life, putting the big coffee pot on to boil. She learned the heft of cast iron, the particular way the floorboards creaked by the door, the sound of Arthur's boots on the gravel path leading to the stable. He remained a distant presence, a man who spoke in necessities and answered in nods. Yet she noticed small things. He always left a stack of freshly split kindling by the hearth for her. When a barrel of flour proved too heavy for her to move, she would find it shifted to the pantry the next morning without a word being said. It was a language of quiet gestures, and she began to understand it as a form of respect. He judged her by her work, and she worked tirelessly, pouring all her grief and anger into scrubbing the floors and kneading bread, determined to earn her keep. One evening, a week after her arrival, a storm blew in from the north, a furious squall of sleet and wind that delayed the westbound stage. The lamps were lit, casting a warm, golden circle in the main room, a fragile defense against the roaring dark. Rebecca sat at the long table, mending a tear in one of the way station's canvas water bags. To keep it flat, she had weighted it down with the only thing she owned that was heavy and smooth. Her father's map, rolled tight and bound with a leather thong. Arthur came in from the stable, shaking the wet from his hat. He moved to the fireplace to warm his hands, the storm having put a deep chill in the air. He was restless, his usual quiet stillness replaced by the coiled energy of a man waiting. He paced the room once, his boots echoing on the planks, before his eyes fell on the table. He stopped, his gaze fixed not on her mending, but on the rolled map. He walked over slowly, his expression unreadable. "That the map from the land office?" he asked. She nodded, her needle freezing in mid-stitch. She expected a comment on its foolishness, perhaps even a note of pity. Instead, he reached out and touched the end of the roll, his calloused finger tracing the pattern of the visible stitches. He was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "When I was a scout for the army," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "we had a tailor with the company. Old man from Prussia. Taught me to see stitches. Said you can tell a man's whole story from his seam." He looked from the map to her face. "This isn't mending," he said, a strange certainty in his tone. "This is a message." He picked up the roll, his touch surprisingly gentle. He pointed to the dense, intricate patterns of thread. "The stitches are too deliberate, too complex. It's not holding anything together." He looked toward the main lantern hanging from a central beam, its bright, steady flame pushing back the shadows. A new light came into his own eyes, a spark of awakening. "Hold it up to the lantern," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Hold it so the light shines through." Rebecca's heart began to hammer against her ribs. It was a fool's hope, a wild and desperate grasping at a shred of meaning where none existed. Yet the intensity in Arthur's gaze compelled her. She took the map from him, her hands trembling slightly as she untied the leather thong. The map unfurled with a soft crackle. It was just as she remembered it, a mess of faded ink and what she had always believed were her mother's protective, decorative stitches. With Arthur watching, she walked to the center of the room and stood on a bench, lifting the map high until it was directly in front of the bright, hissing lantern. For a moment, nothing happened. The thick leather was opaque, the faded ink marks invisible from the back. But then her eyes adjusted. The lantern light was blocked by the heavy, dark thread her mother had used for the border, but it shone clearly through the tiny, almost invisible pinpricks the needle had made in the hide. And then she saw it. A second map, a hidden map, revealed not by ink, but by light. A finer, paler thread, almost the same color as the buckskin, had been used to sew a secret trail. It wasn't a meandering, decorative pattern. It was a clear, deliberate line that cut directly through the crudely drawn mountain range her father had marked as impassable. It traced a path through a narrow canyon, followed a high ridge, and descended into the very heart of the valley he had claimed. Other, smaller stitches formed words, their letters shaky but legible in the glowing perforations. Hales Pass, and below it, a set of coordinates and a note. Survey marker at 3 Pines. It was all there. Her father hadn't been a dreamer, he had been a secret keeper. Her mother had been his accomplice, encoding his discovery with the tools she knew best, a needle and thread. The ink map was a decoy, meant to be dismissed. The real map was a map of light, a legacy of love and trust sewn into the very fabric of their family. Tears streamed down Rebecca's face, hot and silent. Arthur reached up and gently helped her down from the bench, his hand firm on her elbow. He looked from her face to the illuminated map, his expression one of quiet, profound vindication on her behalf. "He found a new way through the mountains," Arthur breathed, the scout in him immediately grasping the significance. "A shortcut. Safer than the southern route. It would change everything for this territory." The storm raged outside, but inside the small, warm way station, the world had gone still and clear. The howling wind was no longer a sound of loneliness, but a call to action. Winter was coming, its breath already cold on the glass. If they were going to prove her claim, if they were going to follow this map of light, they had to go now. There wouldn't be a second chance. They spent the rest of the night at the table, the map spread between them, Arthur's knowledge and her father's secrets finally meeting. The quiet widower came alive, his finger tracing the hidden trail, naming the risks, calculating the supplies they would need. He knew this land. He understood its dangers and its promises. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Rebecca Hale was not alone. She had a map, and now she had a guide. They left 2 days later at the first hint of dawn. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the clean, cold promise of snow. Arthur had packed with swift efficiency, bedrolls, a small sack of oats for his horse, jerky, hardtack, a tin of coffee, and a length of good rope. He saddled his own steady mount and loaded the supplies onto Calder, the old gray horse who accepted the burden with a patient sigh. Rebecca, wearing a pair of Arthur's old trousers and a heavy wool coat he'd found for her, felt a tremor of fear mixed with a fierce, burning resolve. They rode east, away from the established stage route, toward the dark, serrated line of the mountains. The town of Covenant Creek, with its whispers and its judgments, felt a world away. Here, there was only the crunch of the horses' hooves on the frosty ground and the vast, silent witness of the sky. Arthur led them not with bravado, but with a deep, instinctual understanding of the terrain. He read the subtle shifts in the landscape like a man reading a familiar book, pointing out a game trail that would save them an hour's climb, noting the way the trees thinned on a ridge, signaling a lack of water. He was a man in his element, and watching him, Rebecca began to understand that his silence wasn't a sign of emptiness, but of a profound and constant attention to the world around him. By midday, they reached the landmark her father had noted on the map. 3 ancient, wind-twisted pines, standing sentinel at the mouth of a narrow canyon. From the main trail, the canyon entrance was all but invisible, a mere shadow in a wall of rock. But up close, it was a clear, if daunting, gateway. As they guided the horses into the pass, the world changed. The sky narrowed to a ribbon of blue above them, and the temperature dropped. The sound of the wind was replaced by the echo of their own passage and the gurgle of a small, fast-moving creek. This was her father's path. Every rock they passed, every turn in the trail, he had seen it first. The feeling was overwhelming, a conversation across the veil of death. An hour into the canyon, Arthur pulled his horse to a stop. He pointed toward a small clearing near the creek. There, half covered in pine needles and moss, was a flat-topped boulder. Carved into its surface, weathered but unmistakable, were a set of initials and a date. TH 1872, her father's survey marker. Rebecca slid from her horse, her legs unsteady. She ran her fingers over the rough, carved letters, feeling the indentation of the chisel. It was real. All of it. The stories, the letters, the map. They weren't the ramblings of a dying man. They were a true report from a new world he had discovered. She pressed her forehead against the cold stone, and for the first time since his death, her tears were not of grief, but of a fierce, triumphant love. Her father had not left her a lie. He had left her a key. The triumph was short-lived. As they ventured deeper into the pass, the sky above them began to change, the ribbon of blue slowly curdling to a bruised, ominous gray. The wind, which had been absent in the lower canyon, began to moan through the high rock formations, a low, mournful sound that seemed to come from the bones of the mountain itself. Arthur stopped, lifting his face to the sky, sniffing the air like an animal. "Snow," he said, the single word flat and heavy, "and coming fast." He looked around, his eyes scanning the steep canyon walls. The trail ahead grew narrower, with a sharp drop on one side. To be caught there in a whiteout would be a death sentence. "We need shelter. Now." The first flakes began to fall, not the gentle drifters of a light snow, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a rising gale. Within minutes, the air was a blinding chaos of white. The world shrank to the space immediately around them, the path ahead and behind swallowed by the storm. Arthur dismounted, his hand on Calder's bridle, his voice calm but urgent. "Stay close. We'll follow the rock wall." The blizzard descended with a terrifying fury, a physical assault of wind and ice. Rebecca could barely see Arthur, a dark shape just a few feet in front of her. The cold was a living thing, seeping through her coat, her gloves, her very bones. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of her resolve. Just as despair began to set in, Arthur stopped. He had found it. A shallow overhang, not a true cave, but a deep indentation in the rock face, partially shielded by a cluster of stunted, hardy pines. It was barely enough room for the two of them and the horses, but it was their only chance. He led the animals into the back of the space, their warmth and bulk providing a crucial barrier against the wind. He unstrapped a heavy canvas tarp from Calder's pack, and with Rebecca's help, rigged it across the entrance, creating a fragile pocket of shelter against the storm's rage. Huddled together in the cramped space, the roar of the wind just outside their flimsy wall, the illusion of control was stripped away. They were two small, fragile beings at the mercy of the mountain. To fight the encroaching cold, Arthur built a tiny, smokeless fire from a handful of dry twigs he'd gathered, the small flame a precious spot of light and warmth in the frozen dark. In the enforced intimacy, the silence that had defined their relationship finally broke. "My wife, Sarah," Arthur said, his voice quiet, his eyes on the tiny flame. "She died of a fever. Came on fast, like this storm. One day she was fine, the next, gone. I was scouting for the army. I didn't get back in time to say goodbye." He spoke of her simply, of her laugh and the way she loved the wildflowers in spring. Rebecca, in turn, found herself talking about her father, not just the map maker, but the man who had taught her the constellations and who believed that building a home was the noblest work a person could do. They shared their jerky and hardtack, the meager meal feeling like a feast. In the heart of the blizzard, surrounded by danger, two lonely souls shared their stories of loss, and in doing so, forged a bond of trust as strong and resilient as the mountain that held them in its grip. They had come seeking proof of a claim, but what they were finding was something far more vital: a shared path through the wilderness of their own grief. The storm broke at dawn. They awoke, stiff and cold, to a world transformed. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a profound silence and a landscape buried in a thick blanket of pristine snow. The sun rose over the eastern peaks, setting the new world ablaze with a light so pure and brilliant it hurt to look at. Their small shelter had held. They had survived. The journey back was slow and arduous, the deep snow testing the horses and their own endurance, but the shared trial had changed them. The silence between them was no longer one of distance, but of easy companionship. They had faced the mountain together and had not been found wanting. They rode into Covenant Creek 2 days later, disheveled, exhausted, but with a new light in their eyes. They didn't stop at the way station. They didn't stop to rest. They rode directly to the land office, the snow melting from their coats and dripping onto the clean plank floor. Silas Croft was at his desk, a look of smug annoyance on his face at their dramatic entrance. "Miss Hale, Mr. Pike, to what do I owe this rustic intrusion?" Before Rebecca could speak, another man emerged from a back room. He was older, with a stern but fair face and the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. "Judge Emery," he introduced himself, his eyes taking in their trail-worn appearance with keen interest. "I'm the new territorial magistrate. I'm reviewing all recent filings from this office." Rebecca felt a surge of hope. She unrolled the map on Croft's polished desk. "Mr. Croft deemed my father's claim invalid due to an improper survey," she said, her voice clear and strong. Croft scoffed. "As I told you, the map is a piece of fiction." Arthur stepped forward. "It's not fiction." He then laid a piece of paper next to the map. A careful rubbing he had taken of the survey marker, the initials TH clearly visible. "We found this marker at the coordinates hidden in the map's stitching. Rebecca explained. And we followed the trail. There is a pass, Judge. A safe and direct route through the mountains, right to the valley my father claimed. Judge Emery leaned in, examining the map, then the rubbing. He looked at Croft, one eyebrow raised. A hidden trail? A survey marker you conveniently overlooked, Mr. Croft? Croft's face, for the first time, lost its composure. He began to stammer, talking about regulations and paperwork. But the judge ignored him. He looked at Arthur. You've seen this pass, Mr. Pike? You're a former scout, I'm told. In your professional opinion, is it viable? It's more than viable, sir, Arthur said. It's a godsend. It'll cut 3 days off the journey west for freight and settlers. The judge straightened up, his decision made. He looked at Rebecca. Miss Hale, it appears your father was not only a fine surveyor but a discreet one. Your claim is valid. I will see the deed registered in your name by sundown. He then turned his cold gaze on Croft. As for you, sir, we will be having a very long discussion about your filing procedures. The townspeople who had gathered at the door, drawn by the commotion, stood in stunned silence. Their whispers were no longer of pity, but of awe. Silas Croft, the man who held their fates in his ledger, had been undone by a girl with a needlepoint map. Weeks later, the last rays of an autumn sun bathed the valley in a soft, golden light. The air was crisp, holding the scent of pine and the distant promise of winter's return. Rebecca stood on the porch of the way station, a mug of warm coffee in her hands. A new, freshly painted sign hung from the eaves, Hale's Way Station, gateway to the pass. The news of their discovery had spread like a brush fire. Freighters and families were already making plans, waiting for the spring thaw to take the new route. The way station, once a lonely outpost, was now poised to become a vital hub. Her land, her father's legacy, was secure. But as she looked out at the mountains, she knew the land was only part of the inheritance. Arthur came and leaned against the porch railing beside her, not speaking, just sharing the quiet moment. The easy silence between them was now the most comforting sound she knew. He had remained at the way station, his presence as solid and reassuring as the stone of the fireplace. In the aftermath of their return, he had quietly helped her navigate the legal paperwork, his steadfast support a constant anchor. He belonged here as much as she did. The first surveyors for the territorial road are coming through next week, he said, his eyes on the glowing peaks. They want to talk to us, to you. She smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. She had done it. She had honored her father, had reclaimed his name and his dream. But her gaze drifted from the mountains to Arthur's profile, to the sturdy building at her back, to the sense of profound peace that had settled deep in her soul. This place was more than a claim. It was an anchor. Arthur turned to her, a question in his quiet eyes. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. She took a deep breath of the cold, clean air and looked out at the vast, beautiful country that was finally, truly hers. "My father left me a map to a piece of land," she said, her voice soft but sure. "But I think I was meant to find my way home." The words hung in the golden air, a quiet testament to a journey that had led her not just across a mountain range, but to the very center of her own life. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage and hidden truths. The greatest treasures are often not the ones we seek, but the ones we find when we have the courage to follow an unlikely path. If you were moved by Rebecca and Arthur's journey, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more tales from the frontier. We'll see you next time.